The man in the Capuchin Catacombs and the girl with the blinking eyes. It was a trip I had been planning for years, though I'm not entirely sure why. The Capuchin Catacombs of Palermo, Sicily, had always held a strange fascination for me. Maybe it was because the idea of an underground crypt, housing thousands of mummified bodies, was something out of a nightmare, a real-life horror story that few people ever truly grasped. Or maybe it was the legend surrounding Rosalia Lombardo, a little girl whose perfectly preserved corpse had been dubbed the Sleeping Beauty. Her story had haunted me ever since I first stumbled across it in a late-night internet rabbit hole. Rosalia had died in 1920 at just 2 years old, and her father, devastated by the loss, had hired one of the most renowned embalmers of the time, Alfredo Salafia, to preserve her body. The result was astonishing. Even now, over a century later, Rosalia's tiny figure remains almost perfectly intact, with her golden curls and delicate eyelashes making her look as if she's merely sleeping. But that wasn't what intrigued me the most. What truly chilled me to the core were the countless reports of visitors claiming to have seen Rosalia's eyes open, just for a moment, just long enough to make them question whether it had really happened. Some said it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by the way sunlight filtered through the catacombs' narrow windows. Others insisted it was something more, something unnatural. And then there were the whispers about a mysterious man, a shadowy figure who had been seen wandering the catacombs after hours, long after the gates had closed to the public. The stories varied. Some said he was a monk. Others claimed he was a mourner who had refused to leave his loved ones even in death. But one thing was consistent. Whoever this man was, he was always seen near Rosalia's crypt. I had to see it for myself. Palermo is an ancient city, steeped in history and shadow. Its narrow streets wind through crumbling buildings, and the air is thick with the weight of centuries. As I made my way to the Capuchin monastery, where the catacombs are located, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The entrance to the catacombs was unassuming. A small stone building, weathered by time, with a narrow set of stairs leading down into the earth. As I descended, the temperature dropped, and the air grew musty, filled with the scent of old stone and decay. The walls were lined with alcoves, each one filled with the preserved remains of monks, nobles, and commoners alike, their skeletal faces locked in eternal grimaces. The Capuchins, I had learned, had begun preserving bodies in the catacombs as early as the 16th century. Over the centuries, it became a kind of status symbol. If you were wealthy enough, you could pay to be preserved and displayed in the catacombs, your body carefully dressed in your finest clothes, suspended between life and death. As I walked deeper into the crypt, the rows of mummified bodies seemed to stretch on forever. Some were standing upright, their skeletal hands gripping the iron bars that held them in place. Others lay in coffins, their faces covered by dusty veils. It was like stepping into another world, a world where death and life intertwined in a way that felt profoundly unsettling. But I wasn't there for the mummies. I was there for Rosalia. The chamber where Rosalia Lombardo lies is small and unassuming, tucked away at the end of a narrow passage in the children's section of the catacombs. As I approached, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. I had seen pictures of her before, hundreds of them, but nothing could have prepared me for seeing her in person. There she was, lying in a small glass coffin, her body preserved so perfectly that she looked more like a doll than a corpse. Her tiny hands were crossed over her chest, her golden hair curling softly around her face. Her skin, though pale, still had a lifelike quality to it, and her lips were slightly parted, as if she were breathing in her sleep. But it was her eyes that drew me in. They were closed, as they had been for nearly a century. But as I stood there, staring down at her, I couldn't shake the feeling that they might open at any moment. It was a ridiculous thought, but the longer I stood there, the more convinced I became. My heart began to race, and I found myself leaning in closer, almost daring her to blink. Nothing happened. Her eyes remained closed, her face peaceful. But just as I was about to turn away, something flickered at the edge of my vision, a shadow. Quick, fleeting, but unmistakable. I turned my head sharply, but there was no one there. The chamber was empty, save for Rosalia and me. I stood there, frozen in place, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had heard the stories of the mysterious man, of the shadowy figure that appeared near Rosalia's crypt, but I hadn't expected to see anything myself. And yet, I knew what I had seen. For the next few days, I couldn't get the image of Rosalia's eyes and the shadow out of my mind. I had come to Palermo hoping to see something, to experience something beyond the ordinary. But now that it had happened, I wasn't sure what to make of it. I spent hours poring over old articles and testimonies from others who had visited the catacombs. Some of the reports were eerily similar to mine. People claimed to have seen shadows, heard faint whispers, or felt an overwhelming sense of unease when standing near Rosalia's coffin. And then there were the stories of those who swore they had seen her eyes open, just for a brief moment. Before closing again, the scientific explanation, I learned, was that the phenomenon was likely due to changes in humidity and light within the catacombs. As the air shifted, the thin layer of skin over Rosalia's eyes would contract and expand, giving the illusion that her eyes were opening and closing. It was a plausible explanation, but somehow, it didn't feel right. There was something more to it, something I couldn't explain. I returned to the catacombs several times over the next few days, each time hoping to catch another glimpse of the shadowy figure I had seen near Rosalia's crypt. But each visit left me feeling more unsettled. The catacombs were a maze of death, and the deeper I went, the more I felt as though I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. And then, on my fourth visit, something happened that I still struggle to comprehend. It was late in the afternoon when I arrived at the catacombs that day, just an hour before closing time. The crowds had thinned out, and the halls were eerily silent as I made my way toward Rosalia's chamber. I had been there so many times by now that I knew the path by heart, the twists and turns, the rows of mummified bodies, their hollow eyes watching as I passed. When I reached Rosalia's crypt, I found myself alone. The chamber was dimly lit by a single shaft of sunlight that filtered in through a crack in the stone ceiling, casting long shadows across the floor. I stood there for a moment, watching her, waiting for the feeling of unease to wash over me as it always did. But this time, something was different. The air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. I took a step closer to her coffin, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I saw him. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, a trick of the light playing across the walls. But as I looked closer, I realized that the figure standing at the far end of the chamber was no shadow. It was a man, dressed in dark robes, his face hidden in the shadows. For a moment, I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, as the man slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes, though I couldn't see them clearly, seemed to lock onto mine. And in that instant, I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that silent stare, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, the man was gone. I staggered backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I looked around the chamber, half expecting him to reappear, but the room was empty. There was no sign of him, no indication that anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I had seen. After that encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of the catacombs. It was as if a dark presence had latched onto me, refusing to let go. In the days that followed, I began to experience strange occurrences. At first, it was small things. Objects in my hotel room would be out of place, lights would flicker, and I would hear soft whispers in the night, though I could never make out the words. Then the nightmares started. Every night, I dreamed of the man in the shadows. In my dreams, he would stand at the foot of my bed, watching me with those same cold, empty eyes. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, convinced that he was still there, lurking in the darkness just beyond my vision. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the stories of the catacombs get into my head. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something had followed me out of that crypt, and it wasn't going to leave me alone. I returned to the catacombs one final time. Desperate for answers, I spoke to one of the guides, a local man who had worked there for years. When I mentioned the figure I had seen near Rosalia's crypt, his face went pale. "You've seen him too, haven't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my chest. "He's been here for as long as anyone can remember," the guide said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Some say he's one of the monks who used to watch over the catacombs. Others think he's a spirit, trapped here with the dead. But whatever he is, you don't want him to follow you." I left the catacombs that day with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. The man in the shadows was real, and he wasn't going to let me go so easily. By this point, I was desperate. The nightmares had grown worse, and the sense of dread that followed me wherever I went had become unbearable. I felt as though I was being watched constantly, even in broad daylight. No matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man from the catacombs was always just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I reached out to anyone I thought might be able to help. Paranormal investigators, historians, even local priests. Most of them dismissed my story as the result of an overactive imagination, but a few took me seriously. One investigator, in particular, seemed especially concerned. "This isn't just a haunting," she told me during a late-night phone call. "What you're dealing with is something much darker. The man you saw in the catacombs, it's possible he's more than just a spirit. He could be something much older, much more dangerous." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked. "There are certain entities," she said slowly, "that feed off fear. They latch onto people, drawing energy from their terror. It's possible that the man in the catacombs is one of these entities, and by seeing him, you've invited him into your life." I hung up the phone feeling more hopeless than ever. If the investigator was right, then there was no escaping this. The man in the shadows wasn't just haunting me, he was feeding off me, growing stronger with every passing day. With no other options, I decided to confront the man in the shadows head on. I knew it was a dangerous plan, but I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think of anything but the dark presence that had taken over my life. I returned to the Capuchin catacombs one final time, determined to face whatever was haunting me. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of the place settle over me like a shroud. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was suffocating. As I made my way toward Rosalia's crypt, I felt the familiar sense of dread creeping over me. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to keep going. When I reached her chamber, the air was cold, colder than it had been during any of my previous visits. I stood there for a moment, staring down at Rosalia's peaceful face, wondering if she had anything to do with the dark figure that had followed me out of this place. And then I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the chamber, just as he had been before. His dark robes billowed slightly, even though there was no breeze, and his face was hidden in shadow. This time, though, he moved toward me. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. The man's eyes, empty, hollow, locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me for what felt like an eternity. We stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, the man vanished. I staggered backward, gasping for breath, and collapsed onto the floor of the crypt. The cold air seemed to lift, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. In the days that followed, the nightmares stopped. The oppressive sense of dread that had been hanging over me began to fade, and I slowly started to feel like myself again. It was as if the man in the shadows had finally released his hold on me. But even though the haunting seemed to be over, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had come dangerously close to something far darker than I could comprehend. The Capuchin catacombs are a place of death, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead is paper thin. And while Rosalia's eyes may or may not open, there are other things in those crypts, things that defy explanation. I've since left Palermo, but I still think about the man in the shadows. I still dream about him sometimes, though the dreams are different now. He's not chasing me anymore, he's just watching, waiting, and sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he's still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for his next victim.